the content is already like related with the timing as well. So when you have said that we should have separated the podcast into two parts, for me it was at the beginning quite strange because I thought, yeah, I know that it's quite dense and there's too much things on it. But for me, I thought like we can manage it for 2 hours or something like that.
Okay, look, I mean, again, let's just see how it rolls. I'm fine.
Yeah. But since I already have talked with you like 2 years or 3 years ago, I'm pretty sure that we need to separate it for two parts because there's a lot of parts that already like too big.
Yeah.
But so first
look,
of all,
and the thing is that as we're speaking, if you want to return to certain things, because maybe I give an answer that in a sense is a little too dense as well, and you want to sort of take apart things and get into them in more detail, that's fine too.
Yeah. First of all, how are you? How have you been?
I'm fine. We're in a period where we're about a couple of weeks from beginning the new term, and this is my office. This is where I normally am in the university, So everything's fine. I was very concerned since I hadn't heard from you for so long. I was wondering what happened to you, but you seem to be alive and well.
Yeah, I was during that time I was at my hometown, so I left Moscow and I was living in Yakutsk, and then 2 weeks ago I just arrived here, and first thing I wanted to show you is the mountains on my background. Yeah, it's called Tanshanas, I believe. It's bordering with Kyrgyzstan and China. And it's like when I first time saw it, I was impressed because there's nothing such like that, like at my place or either at Moscow, you know. Yeah, and also I surprised that Luke was also interconnected within a podcast. Yeah, because since he's being a producer or something like that. Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, what is the connection between you and? As far as I know, he's your
PhD student, and he was also an undergraduate here as well. So he's had a long connection. We've had a long connection together, actually, and he runs his own podcast. On sort of futuristic topics, So yeah, I mean, and he's really first rate at doing this kind of thing, and he's doing a PhD on how people respond to talking android, basically, that sort of looks a bit like Luke.
Right? So
Luke-looking android.
Horizontal ontology is a Latourian thing or Harman stuff?
Well, actually, at this point, in terms of what theory is going to inform it, I think that's kind of an open question. But I mean, it's part of this general business of trying to figure out how robots get humanized in the course of interaction, right? Because that's one of the things that a lot of people are very concerned about now, both positively and negatively. And Luke has got an interesting kind of experimental setup that would be able to test this with people. So he's doing a PhD on this.
All right. So starting on within, like, let's say your own background, because I haven't managed to explicit that from the first time. Could you just please outline your own background? As far as I know, you've been learning in a Catholic school and then getting a bachelor degree in philosophy / sociology and stuff like that.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm originally from New York City. And Yes, I went to Catholic schools, and in particular, the kind of really formative thing was when I started going to a Jesuit school, and that was pretty early on in my early teens, and that was a very distinctive kind of educational formation. I could say a little bit about that because I think the Jesuits are quite. I mean, when people say Catholic, they get a certain kind of image of Christianity that goes along with it, right? Which is very ritualistic. It's the Mass. It's very ceremonial. Is, as Protestants like to call it, high church, right? It's got a lot of elaborate aspects to it. The Jesuits were an order of the Catholic Church that was invented in the 16th century to respond to the Protestants, because the Protestants were very much about bringing the church back to earth, right? Getting it more in the people, right? People going back to the Bible, right? All this fundamentalism that we hear about comes from Protestantism. And the Jesuits were basically created by the Catholic Church to deal with this. And so the Jesuits basically adopted a kind of stripped down or stripped back version of Catholicism, which started emphasizing much more kind of what we might call the intellectualistic, rationalistic aspects of the Christian religion to be able to debate the Protestants, right? Because the Protestants were very good at this kind of thing of reading the Bible carefully and showing that the Catholic Church was in fact doing things that contradict the Bible, right? That was kind of the way the Protestant modus operandi was. And the Jesuits were basically debating them. And so around this came a certain kind of pedagogy, which is very dialectical, very argumentative, trying to see things from many different sides, trying to kind of gauge the extent to which disagreements have to be amplified or reduced in the course of discourse. And that's the kind of education I had. And I think it's excellent education, by the way. So
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it's an excellent education. It had certain aspects to it. Because the Jesuits, the thing that was also distinctive about it, I have to say, as a kind of branch of the Catholic Church, was that its origins, in terms of the people who were initially recruited to be this particular kind of priest, as it were people largely from the military. Okay, so Ignatius Loyola, who founded the thing, he was a military guy. Okay, and this was also very much part of the Jesuit thing. Very disciplined, very self-disciplined, and expecting that of others. So the education I had was very rigorous, and it did not. For example, in the modern era, it's been quite common for students to be able to have a lot of choice in the sort of courses they take, okay? It wasn't that way when I went to school. We actually had fairly fixed curriculum where you had a kind of minimal range of choices. So it was like whether you took one or two languages, whether you took one or two sciences, but that was pretty much the extent of it, right? Everything else was pretty much uniform. And also when you were in the classroom, it wasn't I mean, you basically had to go into the classroom prepared to be asked at any moment by the teacher to answer a question, right? So in other words, it wasn't one of these situations where, teacher would ask a question and wait for people to put up hands to answer. No, it was rather, you came in there and the teacher will just call on someone arbitrarily to answer a question. And then sometimes the teacher would go to another person in the class and ask them whether they agree or disagree with what the first person said. Okay? This is the kind of education I had, where basically you were kind of always on your guard, right? You were always kind of, it was a pretty intense situation, actually. And it was, it was a scholarship school. So the point is you had to take exams and get interviewed and all that kind of jazz. And so, the kind of people who went to it were kind of already mentally prepared for it at a certain level, even if they were very young. And so and I left that school early. That's the other thing I should say. I was the first person from this school I went to in New York called Regis High School to actually leave 1 year early because I got admitted into Columbia University, which is the big Ivy League school in New York City, right? And so then I moved. So in 1976, when I was 17, I began at Columbia, and I graduated there 1 year early as well. So I graduated in 1979, and I was, in fact, number 2 in the entire class. That is to say, all the subjects together. And at that time, I studied history and sociology as my major. And that was not because I necessarily wanted to be a historian or sociologist, but because it was the major that had the fewest requirements. And that was because I wanted to take courses in lots of different subjects. I mean, my main interest throughout my whole academic career, from the early period as well, when I was in the Jesuit school, was philosophy. Okay, philosophy is the thing that I would say is the red thread, throughout my career. But I didn't want to major in philosophy too early, and that was because at the time, and I think this is still largely the case, the way philosophy was being taught in the English-speaking world, analytic philosophy, right, which is the dominant form of philosophy, still is. It's very narrow in a certain kind of way. I mean, it's rigorous. And of course, when I did my master's degree at Cambridge and then my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in philosophy of science, I got all that training, right? So there was no problem getting the training at some point. But the point was that early in my career, I wanted to explore. And this is something, again, I decided when I was a teenager, right, that I wanted an opportunity to study lots of different subjects, get into them a little bit, start reading around them, anthropology, linguistics, as well as philosophy, literature, drama, there are all these subjects, physics. I mean, I did a little bit of all that stuff when I was at university, actually. And that stuff really stuck with me, and I thought it provided a very good sort of knowledge foundation, so that when I went, I got this fellowship to go to Cambridge when I left Columbia, and then I started, focusing more on the kinds of skills that I, would be, you might say, academically professional skills. So I studied logic very closely. I started studying all this kind of rigorous stuff. I learned kind of the way you write for journal articles and, the academic way of referencing all this stuff now, right? And so, and I did my PhD in history and philosophy of science. That was it, right? But I never lost my interest. I mean, I should say, by the way, one thing I didn't mention yet is that when I was an undergraduate, my minor, because in American universities, you can have a major subject and then a minor subject.
Bologna system.
Yeah, exactly. And the minor subject for me was psychology. And I took a lot of courses in that. And that was, we're talking about the late 1970s. That was a period when a lot of different things were sort of happening at once within psychology, which made it a very kind of interesting field. One was, you might say, kind of the decline or migration of psychoanalysis, which had been actually quite strong in the United States through most of the middle of the 20th century. Freud was very influential in the United States.
He's still.
He is, but the point is, one of the things that happened in the 1970s was that it started to get debunked at the level of psychiatry, at the level of, medicine, right. In other words, what the scientific basis of psychoanalysis started to be challenged in a very serious way. And increasingly, the people who were getting, who were interested in psychoanalysis were moving into literature, were moving into the humanities. And that's kind of where the interest in psychoanalysis is these days, is pretty much, the Judith Butler types, right? People like that are interested in psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis is not such a big deal within psychology proper, and that was beginning to happen in the 1970s. Also, behaviorism, which was the dominant school of academic psychology, B.F. Skinner, all that jazz, right? That was being severely challenged, actually, right? So the dominant school of academic psychology was being challenged primarily by so-called cognitive stuff, right? Cognitive psychology, which was just coming on stream in the late 1970s. Part of it influenced by Noam Chomsky. I don't know if you know, right? Noam Chomsky, early in his career, the way he first made his reputation before people started taking his own positive linguistics project seriously was he wrote this incredibly devastating review of B.F. Skinner's book on the nature of language. B.F. Skinner published a book called Verbal Behavior in 1957. And Chomsky was a young guy at the time, right, barely 30, wrote this incredibly devastating review in the leading linguistics journal. And that really put the behaviorists on the back foot because Skinner's book was incredibly well articulated. Skinner was actually very masterful in presenting stuff. And yet Chomsky just tore it apart. And that was the beginning of the end for behaviorism, basically. And then Chomsky, of course, came up and basically revived this very heavy mind, Cartesian, cognitive kind of thing, which people had thought was dead in psychology, right? All of a sudden, it gets a second lease on life. And then as you move toward the late 1970s and into the 1980s, it becomes this field called cognitive science, right? Because then you start getting the neurophysiologists involved, right? You get the philosophers going gung-ho on all this. And so, in fact, had I not gone to Cambridge on a fellowship for history and philosophy of science, I would have gone to MIT. I was accepted at MIT to do a PhD in psycholinguistics. Okay, which was kind of the Chomsky-like field. Actually, I had an offer Chomsky to do PhD there, and the person who was running that program at the time was a rather well-known philosopher and friend of Chomsky's, who you may have heard of. He died a few years ago, Jerry Fodor.
Oh,
right?
No.
Jerry.
I know him, but I didn't know that he's.
He began as kind of the philosophical kind of counterpart to Chomsky, right?
He's into philosophy of mind.
Yeah, and both of them were at MIT for a long time. And in the 1970s, Fodor with his psycholinguistics just about to boost into a more generalized field of cognitive science. It was very exciting, right? So it was a very exciting time, and I almost went that route. Okay, I almost went that route, and at this point I would have been a cognitive scientist or something now, or maybe doing computer modeling and being involved in contemporary artificial intelligence. I might have been doing that now.
Yeah, it's good because cognitive science nowadays is just dominating everywhere.
Oh, yeah. And this is where it began. So it's a very exciting period, actually, to be thinking about the nature of psychology during this period in the late 1970s. And I took courses in cognitive psychology. And even though the level of the computer programming at the time was very unsophisticated, nevertheless, we were being told computers were the future and that computers were the appropriate model for understanding the mind. This was something that cognitive psychologists were constantly kind of pushing down our throats. And in fact, at Columbia was so keen on all this that they required, as part of because Columbia is a university, like a lot of these Ivy League universities, Columbia has a kind of general education requirement where everybody, regardless of your major, have to take a certain kind of set of core courses, right? And so one of the core courses that I had to take as a first-year student at Columbia was computer programming, okay? 1976-77, we were required to do computer programming, and we were taught basic Fortran, COBOL. I don't know if you remember these things. These are from a long time ago now. These are kind of like the original computer programs, okay? They're very Mickey Mouse by today's standards, right? But what you did when you learned computer programming back in the late 1970s, right, you actually learned proper programming, right? You learned how to put the lines in the right order so they could execute the program, right? There was none of this interface bullshit, that Steve Jobs invented, right? It was none of this kind of, things look user-friendly. No, you actually had to be thinking about a computer program like doing a mathematical proof, right? The only thing you had in front of the screen was the algorithm. And then if you got it right, it produced an output. And the only way you knew whether it produced an output was whether the output came out right. That was the way it was back then. And it was all mainframe. So we had to take turns on mainframe computers and do our little homework assignments. because nobody had portable computers back then, right? Didn't happen until the late 1980s. But we were required to do that, you see, because that was the future. That was the future in 1976, 77, was that we were going to need to learn computer programming. That was going to be as important as knowing a second language. That's what we were told. And I'll tell you what happened. You know, the interesting thing is that died. That died.
Why?
Because of Steve Jobs. As soon as you started getting user-friendly interfaces for operating complex computational devices, smartphones, whatever, then the need to program, the mentality involved in programming, right, the whole algorithmic mind, right, that supposedly is dominating the world now, you didn't need to acquire it yourself, right? You didn't need to know anything, right? You just had the interface do it for you, right? And the interface is basically designed in a way to enable the dumbest user to get the biggest results, right? This is why all these computer devices sell so many copies, right? That they're so big, such big business. The point is, you don't need to. You could be a perfect computer dummy and still be able to do amazing things with your smartphone. Okay, and that was the biggest mistake. The biggest mistake was to prevent people, to stop people from having to learn how to program computers, as soon as things became very user-friendly.
Now it's called vibe coding, when you're just asking ChatGPT and starting your own, like, pet project or any project, such as startup. Yeah, but let's focus on STS and the social epistemology part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, how did you integrate it within the whole field?
Okay, so here's
since
the
the
thing.
beginning.
Yeah. So this is a little more what should we say? A little more accidental in a sense, right? It's not as because a lot of my education actually I was quite deliberate about. So the way I told it to you is kind of how I thought about it.
Retrospectively.
Yeah, I don't think so in other words, I made very deliberate decisions in terms of like leaving Jesuit school early and, and leaving Colombia early and making choices with regard to, where I went and so forth. There's another part of the story where I basically turned down Harvard and Princeton for a PhD because I didn't want to be a historian of science. I wanted to be a philosopher of science. And that's another part of the story that I did deliberately as well. And that's why I went to Pittsburgh rather than Harvard or Princeton for the PhD, was because of the nature of the subject matter. All of that is deliberate. Now, the social epistemology thing, in a way, is more, I would say, a story of taking advantage of an opportunity. So in other words, it's not something, it was something that, okay, so you got to be kind of where I was in the early 1980s. So I'm doing this PhD. And one of the things that becomes very important, and this is where science and technology studies, which was just beginning at that time, was actually quite, in a way, shed some very interesting light on the way in which academic disciplines were operating. Let's put it that way. Because science and technology studies is kind of a funny field. Well, it's interdisciplinary, obviously. So it's not just sociology of science, right? It's not just that. Because, first of all, sociology of science, before science and technology studies, tended to be very, very institutional, very structural. It didn't really talk very much about how knowledge was actually constructed on the spot, right? It did, the thing that we normally call social constructivism, is usually regarded as a kind of micro-sociological school because it usually deals with the way in which individuals or groups of people actually kind of construct the knowledge that they then put forward to the world. But before science and technology studies, the way the sociology of knowledge and science tended to be discussed was much more at the level of worldview, right? The scientific worldview, religious worldview, right? And then talking about the social structures that promoted and maintained and so forth, all of those things. That was kind of the level at which sociology of science tended to be conducted prior to science and technology studies. So even if you're looking at somebody like Robert Merton, right, the sociologist of science, the American sociologist of science, who's very famous for putting forward these 4 norms of science, okay? Now, science and technology studies just dismissed all the, I mean, in a sense, it deconstructed all that stuff because from the standpoint of science and technology studies, right, all of these norms of science, right, which are the things that the scientists advertise that makes their knowledge scientific, right? So we're talking about the organized skepticism and communalism of knowledge, right? It's collectively owned and shared, right? The universalism of knowledge, right? All of this kind of stuff, right? Merton was talking about. And of course, scientists are always talking this way too, right? They always say this is kind of what makes our knowledge really distinctive, right? Science and technology studies basically deconstructed that because, in a sense, the scientists did not live up to their own rhetoric, right? Science did not match the hype. That's the way to put it. And that was a very striking aspect of science and technology studies for someone like me, okay? Because it struck many different chords at once. Which I thought were quite relevant. One of them, of course, and I think this was much more evident when I was a student back in the 80s than it would be today, and that was that there was a certain kind of, how should we say, a certain kind of affinity between this kind of science and technology studies deconstruction of science with ideology critique. With Marx, a certain, especially kind of Western-style Marxism, which was very focused on, books like the German ideology, all these early Marx books, right? That part of Marx was very much in line with what science and technology studies seemed to be saying, and so that was kind of attractive in a way, because there was this kind of, one shouldn't underestimate the role that Western Marxism played within the academy. As a kind of a background critical noise, you might say, that sort of helped to usher in, what became postmodernism and all this other stuff that happened later in the 80s and the 90s. So there was that was kind of attractive, and especially because it was about science. And the way that the science and technology studies people tended to do it was also sort of attractive, because if you look at something like Bruno Latour, Laboratory Life, which was work that was very influential in my own thinking. In fact, to my mind, this was the work that really mattered as far as I was concerned for him. The thing that's interesting about this book, right, is the pretext of the book. Again, I don't know if you've read it, but this book, it basically, Latour starts off by saying, look, the best way to understand a tribe, right? So he does this anthropology thing, right?
Yeah.
The best way to understand a tribe is to basically go in there, kind of open-minded, because you don't know anything about them. Right, so you come in there as kind of an ignoramus, and Latour, being a guy who was schooled in philosophy, and actually is himself someone who comes from a Jesuit background as well, right? He's not a scientist, right? He's not a scientist. He's kind of a philosopher,
Yeah.
he comes in there and he gets a job, right, as a guy who he's a lab technician, basically. He's cleaning out test tubes, right? But what that enables him to do in that kind of lowly position is that he's a participant observer of what the scientists are doing, what they're saying to each other, how they're interpreting stuff, and he asks questions, often these kind of very a friend of mine likes to talk about Latour's way of doing anthropology is a bit like the French detective Inspector Clouseau. Are you familiar with this kind of character? Okay, well, there's this British comedian by the name of Peter Sellers, who was a real big deal in the 1960s and 70s, and Peter Sellers kind of invented this kind of French detective. Okay, a kind of parody of a French detective who's really kind of clueless, but tries to come across as very smart, but is just clueless, right? he's the opposite of the American detective Columbo. I don't know if you've ever heard of Columbo. There's an American detective called Columbo who has the exact opposite sort of way of being, right? Who looks clueless but is really very smart. No, Clouseau's the opposite. And Latour kind of comes across like Clouseau in when he's dealing with scientists, right? So he would start off by thinking that he understands what the scientists are doing, but then he talks to them and he realizes he doesn't have a clue what's going on at all. And what that ends up leading to is a kind of highly demystified view of how the scientific process works. Okay, so the scientists, at the end of reading Laboratory Life, they no longer seem to be these great, epistemic gods or anything, right? They seem to be kind of not a bunch of clowns exactly, but basically, guys just kind of scrambling around, trying to get stuff to work and, doing very ad hoc things, And then when they write their journal articles, right, they're kind of like, making shit up, that's putting it a little strongly, but basically kind of massaging things and making things look clearer than they really are, right? And they have all these meetings actually to decide, what exactly they're going to say about the data, because there's lots of disagreement. And so somehow they got to reach resolution. And so how the compromises happen and so forth. But the point is, by the end of the book, you get an incredibly clear sense of how scientific knowledge is constructed, literally, right? From the beginning to the end, you might say. And it's it's a kind of funny book to read in a way, and kind of smart philosophically. And so that book was very influential in my thinking. And I thought, more can be done with this, right? This is what I thought as a kind of at a kind of more theoretical philosophical level, more can be done with this. And that was kind of social epistemology in a way was kind of I got into it. You might say as a way of answering the following question, namely, given what Latour is saying here, and let's say we believe what he's saying, let's say he's giving something like an empirically adequate account of how the scientific practice works, then how are we going to pick up the pieces? How are we going to, in a way, come up with an account of science, not only that's empirically adequate in the way Latour has, but one that actually can provide a basis for people wanting to do it and for people thinking that some knowledge is produced, right? So in other words, how do you reassert the normative character of science once it's been demystified so much, right? It's kind of like it's like the question people always ask about religion. Yes, it's great that we have these very demystified notions of religion, but then why do you believe? Right? I mean, if what's there left to believe? Right? If you start, if you have Feuerbach's account of religion and the essence of Christianity or something like that, right? And you take that kind of anthropological account of the origin of gods and things like this, right? Then okay, fine. But then why do you want to believe any of this stuff? Right? Why do you want to believe what this stuff's about if you actually have this kind of empirical image of it? And I think that's the challenge that social epistemology, at least in my mind, was trying to face, namely, because Latour, this is the other thing about Latour, which has always made him very kind of cute in a way, but often kind of elusive, and that is that he says, I love science. I love science. That's what, right? He's saying how much he loves science. He doesn't hate science. He loves science. I said, well, with friends like you, we don't need enemies, right? I mean, this is the thing that you have to figure out. What is there left of science? How do you need to think about science in order for science to have, to kind of recover, as it were, normatively? And so that's where social epistemology began in my mind. Now, the term itself, social epistemology, originated actually opportunistically because there were some analytic philosophers who were already using this phrase to talk about, so analytic philosophers have this kind of very individualistic epistemology and so forth, but they were gradually beginning to realize, as they get more knowledgeable of the philosophy of science, that there was this need for social accounts of knowledge. And so they used the word social epistemology for that. And so there was a special issue of a very important journal in analytic philosophy called Erkenntnis, which is an old journal of the logical positivists, which is published in somewhere in Central Europe. And that journal had a special issue on social epistemology in the early 80s, and I was invited to contribute to it because I had published a couple of things already as a graduate student which used this phrase. Okay, and I was also already plugging into the science and technology study stuff, and part of what I was doing as a graduate student was to get that stuff of Latour and Canor-Cetina and Bloor and Barnes and all those other guys, to get them into analytic philosophy circles, have analytic philosophers look at this stuff. And I wrote a couple of articles early in my career that were particularly targeted in that direction. And so I got invited to apply for this special issue, and I sent an article in, which became then the core of the book, Social Epistemology, that was published in 1988, and also the basis on which I started the journal in 1987 called Social Epistemology. I'm sorry, I've gone on for such a long time, but that's basically how social epistemology, how my relationship to science and technology studies. Yeah.
Yeah, let me sum up. You were in a rigorous school, growing up as a sophist, kind of, so to speak. Yeah. Training in rhetoric and stuff like that. And then you were clueless what kind of specific program you need, but you were intuitively landed at the philosophy background, right? And then simultaneously there is Latour coming up and showing everyone that science could have been demystified or something like that. I mean, Latour, for me, for example, I'm pretty much aware of his works, and what he did to science is not just he wanted to debunk it. He wanted to just to make it stronger. When, for example, scientists. Yeah, for example, when scientists they're doing their own stuff, constructing these methodologies, working on data, whatever, on the empirical level, and then there's one philosopher, very with a strong background and well prepared, and then he says, guys, You've been working here and there, but this is how it works, right? And he sort of opened the black box for sociology. For sociology,
that's the orthodox line. Now that we say, because Latour is regarded as such an important figure now. I'm just saying what it was like when you're actually in the beginning.
Oh,
you have a retrospective view of Latour.
Yeah, of course. I'm judging retrospectively, and then sociology is just being involved into physics. I don't know, mathematics, basically everywhere. For example, there's a case of Harry Collins. He was trying to understand how the scientist works with new object, which is gravitational waves. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, I mean, we could have a whole discussion about what happened to science and technology studies and how the different early figures, the different directions they went. Because I think, if we want to talk about Latour, and I don't want to spend the whole time talking about him because, in a sense, he at a key point, he basically realized that all the stuff he was saying was actually having negative impact on science, right? In 2004, basically, right? Why critique has run out of steam. And at that point, he becomes this kind of enormous realist, right? This multivalent, multiple worlds, multiple objects, realist thing.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's kind of the postmodernists love all this stuff, and he's become post-humanist and Gaia and all the rest of it. But I do think you know, when you look back on the impact he actually had, I don't mean, you know, the people who like him. I mean, you know, what's been his impact on science? I mean, I think, you know, insofar as he has had an impact on science, it's been a kind of quite a critical impact, and I don't blame him for that, right? I actually think that's a very good feature about his work, is that actually he did a very proper demystification. It's just after a while he disowned it. Right? He disowned it because he, like Harry Collins, like a lot of these STS people, wanted to be loved by the scientists. I mean, you know, and so they kind of, in a way, evolved, you might say, in a direction toward realism, toward science, you know, toward the scientific establishment even. I mean, you even see this in somebody like Donna Haraway. Okay? Donna Haraway, she's very pro-scientific establishment. I mean, nowadays. Okay? And so for somebody like me, who kind of came through the history of all this, it's kind of an interesting trajectory, because these people basically, I would say, over time become more and more conservative.
Mm-hmm.
They become more and more conservative. I mean, I think the thing is, with people like Latour, he's really good at dressing it up in metaphysics to make it look exciting. But if you look at it from the standpoint of what it means, let's say at a policy level or something like that, it's kind of conservative, very precautionary, certainly, with regard to the environment and so forth. You know, a very, you know, very kind of very toned down kind of policy orientation, I would say. And this is true of Haraway and all the rest of them. And people like Harry Collins, well, they're basically just celebrating expertise these days. Right? They are celebrating, they are defending expertise more than even the philosophers normally do these days.
Yeah. I remember his last book.
Yeah.
The Defense of Expertise.
Yeah, so you see that this is, you know, so this is why the whole science and technology studies thing, I mean, it was great while it lasted, but I would say that, you know, I mean, you know, one of the key thing to me that made the difference, that kind of caused this sort of shift I'm talking about, is the so-called science wars in the 1990s. I think that made a big difference to all these people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know. Do you know about this? The science wars? What these things were about? Yeah,
of course.
Well, I think it, because after the science wars, I think what you see is a lot of these more established STS people become more conservative.
Mm-hmm. So coming back, you from the US, as far as I understood, you moved to the UK because of your education. I mean, basically for educational purposes.
What you mean at Cambridge?
Pittsburgh.
Yes, for Cambridge.
Cambridge.
You mean when I went to Cambridge, or when I came now?
No. I'm talking about in general, like when you just moved from the US to UK. What was the meaning behind it?
Well, I think it was a different meaning when I moved in 1979 to go to Cambridge versus what I did in 1994 when I went to the University of Durham, and since then have stayed in the UK. So the two different moments, in the sense where I moved to the UK.
You could have elaborated both of them.
Okay, well, look, the thing about Cambridge really had to do with the field, history and philosophy of science, which I had learned about as an undergraduate, because that was kind of a hot field when I was an undergraduate, because it actually brought history and philosophy in a very interesting kind of combination with regard to science. So people like Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper and Imre Lakatos and Paul Feyerabend, those were big guys, right, in terms of discussing all these issues back when I was a student. And I thought that was pretty exciting stuff. And I remember the books that I owned at the time, those were the books that I had the most marginal notes on, right? You know, where you're writing on the margins of the books and things. And so that was kind of my first preference. And I also, I mean, there's also a background thing. I come from a family, and maybe it's also my education with the Jesuits as well, generally being very European oriented. I mean, and that's another thing I have to say about, you know, being an American when I was an American. I think I'm probably the last generation of people Americans, at least, who somehow felt the need to be educated at some point in Europe. Okay, because that was quite common, actually, among people who had university education in the United States. Who were kind of relatively elite, that they would go to Europe at some point and get a degree there or do something there. But that really, after World War II, that really started to decline substantially. And in fact, I would be hard pressed to think about people from the generation after me who are American who have somehow felt the need to get an education in Europe at some point. But I am still of that, that age or that mentality that thought that European education is actually very important to understand Europe, to go to Europe. Europe is the source of all wisdom, this kind of thing. Western civilization began in Europe, it almost ended in Europe, and so I was very much part of that mentality. So it was in that sense, it was quite an easy move to make. And so that I think is part of it as well. So it wasn't such a hard decision to make for me. In 1994, it was a totally different story. It was basically, what should we say? It was for job reasons. In other words, in 1994, I was a recently tenured associate professor in the United States. I had gone back to Pittsburgh, actually. Okay, so they hired me back at Pittsburgh to start a program on the Rhetoric of science back in 1993, and I was there for 1 year. But then I got invited to apply for an open chair in sociology at the University of Durham in the northern part of this country, and Durham's a prestigious university, and I decided to go for it, and I got it, and it was a big step up. I mean, the thing there is an issue about how academic jobs are determined in the U.S. versus the U.K., which was a kind of important point. In the U.S., generally speaking, academic jobs are determined primarily at the department level, with perhaps some university oversight, with regard to diversity, inclusion, all that stuff that people talk about these days. But otherwise, it is largely a department-based appointment. So the people in the department that you would belong to decide on whether to hire you. In the UK, and in other European countries as well, it's different. It's a much more top-down decision. So in other words, the senior administration of the university get directly involved in hiring all the major appointments. Okay? And in fact, the department itself only has a kind of voice, but it doesn't have a decisive voice, doesn't have a determining voice. It's ultimately the decision of the university senior administration about who to get hired. And that actually favored me. Okay? That system, top-down decision on hiring, actually favored me, because the way universities tend to hire in Europe is they look at you and see whether you're a good representative of the university. They're less concerned about whether you fit into the department. Okay? But if you hire at the department level, right, then the people in the department who are hiring you are going to wonder, do you fit in with us? Are you can you be a team player? Blah, 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 right? And so that's a big difference. And so I do think that the European style of hiring actually favored me. And so I moved, right? And I've been there ever since. But it was that straightforward. It was a kind of, I was invited to apply for a job, and I applied, and I got it.
Yeah, because of meritocratic system. Isn't any change since then, or any dynamics been shifted?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean,
that's what I'm talking about.
Okay, so look, I mean, some of it is the same, right? Namely that it's still a top-down appointment here in Britain, and it's still the same.
Old school, maybe.
Well, no. I mean top-down. I mean that senior administration decides, right? So in other words, departments are still weak in this regard, right? The departments themselves aren't really I mean, they have a voice, but they're not decisive. That's still the same. What's not the same is actually the qualities that universities are looking for in potential professors. Okay, they're looking for different things now. This is not to say they don't still look for people who have a lot of publications and are, academically famous or whatever. They still look for that, but they really are concerned to a large extent with your ability to bring in money, right? Grant raising, right? Bringing in funds. And in fact, I would say, it's a question that just gets asked, right? Because I've been on a lot of these panels interviewing other people to be professor, it comes up all the time, right? Somebody always asks the candidate the question, how are you going to bring in some money? They have polite ways of asking the question, of course. They say, do you have any major research projects in mind? Right? Which means you would have to raise some money for it.
Connection loss.
And part of it, by the way, and part of it, by the way, is due to the fact that, hello? You still there? Yeah. Because your screen is freezing a little bit.
Yeah, I'm lagging right now. Is it good? Is it better now?
Your screen, the image of you on the screen for the last few minutes has been kind of blurry, a little blurry. Let's put it that way. I don't think all the pixels are operating.
Yeah, I was lagging.
Yeah. And
now it's good.
Yeah, but it's a little better now. I certainly can hear you. So basically what would happen is that if you're not the sort of person who can raise a lot of money, you're less interesting, right? Because the universities actually want people whose grants will be able to pay the salaries of people in the university. Okay, that's kind of the bottom line, because universities are struggling for money these days. Right, that's the one factor, right? The financial factors of universities is a big deal, and so you hire a professor, you want to say, okay, how much money can you help us with? So people often get hired, right. So if you're the kind of person who likes to get grants, right, and you get a big grant, the first thing you want to think about doing is, I want to go to a better university. This is my calling card, right? This is the thing I can say up front to these guys. Hey, look, you hire me, you'll get this, number of million of pounds or whatever, right? That's a big difference. I would say that's the biggest noticeable difference between then and now, is the financial thing.
Well, now I want to just share a little bit like my own background.
Sure.
I think I've told you 2 or 3 years ago that I have changed my name, and as you can see it now, my name is Andres, not Andre, because I'm just intentionally made this shift. The reason why I did this is that because after, let's say, 6th century, my land being Christianized, and of course most of the people, I would say major people of my population, are like upholding Slavic Russian name and surname. And also my own people, they are from the archaic period, which means that they only have names. They don't have a surnames or anything like that. Yeah. And I called myself not like dramatically something completely different. I just shifted it to the ancient Greece style because of philosophy, of course. And considering my surname, it's Japanese. I don't know. I just pick it up like randomly. No, no particular, no particular reason in that. And when I realized that only let's say relatively recently, because when I came here in Kazakhstan, and of course like everywhere else, people just they're not just getting shocked, they're getting surprised. Why do you like uphold this Russian name? It's very strange. It's a similar, for example, here in Kazakhstan, that think Asian people having, for example, Muslim names, or like consistent name from the Arab culture, which is kind of weird. Yeah, even Kazakh people keep telling that. And if I would try to, once again, retrospectively, understand why I enrolled into that specific university, which is Shaninka. You might heard of it. The most liberal university in Russia, considered to be. I, like, since my childhood, I always was interested in philosophy, right? And for some reason, I thought this is not, it's not manageable. You cannot make money out of that. You can just only stuck within academia or something like that. And I thought, well, sociology is, maybe it's a big thing. I was quite young at that time. And I just chose that particular university, immersed within this liberal, like British liberal analytic school. And after I have finished that, I wrote a bachelor thesis in a theoretical level, and I remember words of my, so to speak, like support manager or something like that, the administrator of the faculty. She told me that nobody writes theoretical work. Everyone writing, this is bachelor degree, case studies, empirical work. You just making this fragment chunk of something, and you sort of like trying to align within science. But in my case, I just wrote a theoretical work, and she said to me that nobody ever did something like that. And 5 years ago, one guy tried, but even though he failed, and I'm trying to analyze it like 2 years later. I've not only wrote a theoretical work, right, which is already rare. For my even assumption, I made a statement which is combining all. I mean, I've been researching in sociology of scientific knowledge, like in a serious level. I've been like living in library, 12 hours reading every single day for 2 years or something like that. This is just insane. And I came up with an idea that tightly aligned with the symmetry principle. That's the reason why we're even talking. And of course, I grabbed 3 figures. First, David Bloor, the one who just designed all of that, and then Bruno Latour and you. And I, one of my the advisor of my diploma said to me, you shouldn't just make some fragment or some chunk in order to analyze. Like, raise your voice. This is in this university. They always keep telling you, raise your voice. Okay, so I raised my voice, and I sort of constructed a new ontology. I just called it object-subject ontology or something like that. Okay, and during my defense, when they read my thesis, everyone said we just don't understand. Like, there is 1, 2, 3, 5 figures who is covering up this thesis and defense, and all of them have said we haven't understood anything. And if you may know, the Viktor Vakhshtayn, who used to be my dean, he had a best student, quote unquote. His name is Pavel Stepantsov. And he told me, you're either a marginal freak or unrecognized genius. And he was looking at me like in the way that you're definitely a marginal freak. And at that time, I thought, like, I made a like titanic effort in order to like do something, right? And then they're like raising eyebrows, like, why are you even doing this? And at that time, I wasn't aware why is that happened, and the reaction from the advisors and the professors. But now I do understand. It's the difference between the school program and the analytic, like this analytic fashion that been bring from the Europe, because mainly I was focusing, of course, on continental thought, and it's sort of my university living like in this kind of bubble. I'm living in this kind of bubble, and they're not like interlinked.
And can I just ask a question about because I remember your thesis. In fact, I had the thing kind of Google translated into English, and I read it. And I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's quite analytic versus continental that's going on. It just seems to me, and again, this might sound a little too boring or pedestrian, but I do think that there is a certain kind of academic, regardless of what their intellectual school is, who basically doesn't believe that students, especially undergraduate students, are entitled to assert, to kind of assert their voice, as your supervisor was telling you to do, right? They just don't want that to happen in a thesis, right? They because obviously, if you do assert your voice, and part of what you're doing in asserting your voice is representing the various things you're reading, right? Which is largely not on the curriculum, right? That there's a sense in which it's kind of vaguely threatening to academic authority, right? Because academic authority ultimately rests on kind of a control over the curriculum, right? In other words, the thing you want to hold the student accountable to is the stuff that you are the master of, right? And that's what you expect to find in the pages of the student. And if the student is now talking about stuff that you haven't read before, right? You barely have heard of some of these people, right? That's very threatening, right? Because they're going to have to pass judgment on it, and they don't even know where to begin. And so I do think it's more at that level, right? It's more at that level because I think there are versions of this that affect all schools of thought, depending on which one happens to be the orthodoxy, right? So you could have the tables reversed, right? You could imagine that there are universities where continental philosophy is the dominant orthodoxy, right? And then they see some guy coming along who's talk about Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore and guys like that, and they just freak out, right? And especially if it looks like that some of what they're saying is at least at an implicit level critical of what the orthodoxy is upholding, right? You don't even have to be directly criticizing them, but it could be that simply the formulation, the way you formulate questions, the way you approach matters is itself threatening because it is simply not orthodox. And I do think, that is often what the story is, especially if we're talking about an undergraduate thesis, right? I mean, it's undergraduates, right? They're supposed to be, they're not supposed to be asserting themselves. They're just supposed to be passing and getting good marks.
Yeah.
No, so I think it's as simple as that in a way.
Why I'm keep spreading this discourse is it because I want to talk about your book, the latest book, that's connected with the university as a whole.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And
it's a good transition, because you might think to yourself, what value does the university have anymore?
Yeah. And for me, for example, for like considering my own feedback about getting the education, Bologna system, bachelor degree, you have asked me, should I definitely should maybe consider getting a PhD or getting a master's degree, whatever. But for me, I think it's not relevant anymore. Like, I'm not even considering that because, first of all, as I already have said, this is the things that I'm saying is relatively quite marginal. Like, there is not even a field or space that have appeared in something like that. I mean, I literally created something new. Okay, and if I'm trying to align with orthodoxy, either Europe or the US. It doesn't matter. I don't want to receive these eyebrows towards my face anymore. Yeah, and and the second part, I think I'm already. This is a bold statement, of course, but I think that I'm already overly educated, even at the bachelor's degree. Like, this is. I already, when I finished bachelor degree, I felt like I got PhD.
Well, look, can I say, I'll say something about this, because you raise a really good points here. I mean, okay. First thing I would say is that, let's say, one reason why the reason why I was suggesting that you might do a master's or PhD. And by the way, I don't actually recommend this to most of my students. I actually don't, but I recommended it to you because you're a really smart guy, right? An academically smart guy. And that it ends up, and that I do believe that especially when you get to the PhD stage, that you do have a bit more freedom. Okay? You have a bit more freedom. You're not going to be judged in quite. I mean, I'll give you a sense, right? So I supervise PhD students, and you agree the topic, right? You have to agree the topic up front, and so if you want to do something, kind of a bit crazy or funky or whatever, I have to buy into it. So if I buy into it, I am in a way responsible for getting you through. Okay? I mean, at least this is the way I look at it, right? So there's a sense in which there's a kind of a buy-in, right? And also because the whole point of doing a PhD is that you become an independent researcher, right? So PhDs are supposed to be original, you might say, in a way in which a bachelor's thesis may not be so original. At least, that's the theory. I mean, it doesn't always work that way, but the point is that, so in other words, if you want to think about a space where you could get academic, respect for the kind of thing you're doing in the bachelor's degree, then a PhD would be the place to do it. And moreover, I would say even with this bachelor's thesis of yours, I could see this being kind of in English. So we would have to get properly in English, not just Google translate it into English. But an English version of this, I think, could be published. I mean, So in other words, if you wanted to, if in some sense what you wanted to do was to extend this into a PhD, on the symmetry stuff, right? And this kind of new ontology that you're floating, and you wanted to actually kind of use that bachelor's degree as kind of a launch pad for a kind of more expanded project where one could see the implications of your ontology and your metaphysics and all this, so people can actually get a sense of, what's the value of having this new way of looking at the world. Then that would be a PhD project, right? And the fact that you did this bachelor's degree would be a good down payment, you might say, right? In that sense. So I just think, this is my view. I mean, the more general point about being overeducated, I think is spot on, actually. So in other words, I do believe that if you really do attend to your studies when you're an undergraduate, and you take advantage of all the things that you can be learning by being in the university, a bachelor's degree is good enough. And in fact, has been good enough for most educated people throughout history, okay? It is only after World War II that people start to fetishize the PhD as a kind of credential degree, okay? Because before World War II, the sort of people who got PhDs were people who wanted to do specific focused research on a topic. And that could be an academic or a non-academic, okay? It was not a credentialing degree. It was not the kind of degree that you needed in order to get an academic job. And in fact, I could tell you, because Britain is the last of the major countries to actually require a PhD for a permanent academic post. When I came to Durham, again, a strong university in this country, back in 1994, most of the senior staff did not have a PhD. Okay? And if you look at a lot of these Oxford philosophers, these big cheeses, right, that have existed in the second half of the 20th century, we're talking about Michael Dummett or John Austin or Gilbert Ryle, all these people, they didn't have PhDs. Okay? They trained PhDs, but they didn't have PhDs themselves. Okay? And so, I do think the problem is that and it's a very interesting sociological problem, because what's basically happened is that the university has been more and more co-opted into the social stratification of society, right? So in other words, the reason why everybody's getting all these degrees, master's degrees, PhDs, all that jazz, right, is because you need new ways of structuring the society because people are too educated. So what you do is you require them to get a little bit more education, right? And a little bit more education. And then you could slot them into jobs that way, right? And only the people who can kind of jump through all the hoops end up getting the jobs. And this applies in academia too, because after you get the PhD, you don't necessarily get a job. You get a postdoc, and maybe you get 2 or 3 postdocs, and you don't get your first real job until you're close to 50. I mean, this is the way it works these days, guy. I mean, and we had a guy here who basically fits that to a T, and so it seems to me that you're right. So you're right about the overeducated point, and I think in the long term, or maybe even in the medium term, this is not sustainable. In other words, I think that this whole higher education business of everybody having to get all these degrees in order to prove themselves is going to burst. It's unsustainable. The jobs that these people end up getting do not warrant the education, right? So now what we're suffering from throughout the world is a bunch of overeducated people given the jobs they're actually performing, right? It's amazing. You got PhDs driving taxis these days, right? This is the kind of thing. You could probably have a conversation about Kant with your Uber driver. I mean, it's this kind of thing, because this is the only jobs these people can find. And so I do think you're right on that point, right? That there's nothing, as it were, from a sociological standpoint, that really requires that you get overeducated and get more and more degrees. My point is, however, from the standpoint of, you might say, self-expression, right? From the standpoint of actually wanting to get your ideas out there and sort of, in a way that you feel comfortable with, that, there it is. Here is what I stand for. These are my views, right? Actually, a PhD might be useful for that purpose. That's my point.
Yeah, but I do generally, I don't understand, why do I need PhD in order to elaborate my thesis further? I could have
you could do it another way, sure. No,
yeah, I could have just
sure.
Yeah, for example, through YouTube or something like that. There is
and
a bunch of examples. Nickland.
Yeah, you could put it online. You could do a lot of things. No, I understand that. I understand that. I'm just saying, from the standpoint, because you have to think about, okay, what is going to be your the metric that you use to evaluate whether you're you're hitting your market, right? I mean, are you getting to the people you want to get to, right? You got to think about what your strategy, who you try to get to in terms of communicating, and whether you're doing it the most effective way. I'm just saying, when you're writing about the topics you're writing about in your bachelor's thesis, right? It's going to be academics, some people who are very people who have a lot of academic training and very intelligent people are going to be the ones who are going to be able to make sense of what you're saying, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that they need to be professors, and it's true they don't need to be in universities and all that. I agree, right? But nevertheless, if you really, given what you wrote in there, and if that's the way you're going to be writing, okay, then I do think you have to say, okay, how do I attract this kind of audience that is going to be able to, appreciate what I'm doing?
Yeah, I got it. But even like right now, at a general level of CS influence, all of that, like technocracy, I've spoke with many people, many young people in Discord from the rest of the world, from the basically what's happening right now, and most of the time I hear the same line. I hear that, well, you could have get, for example, undergrad diploma. Yeah, but you could have just avoid it, or either skip that part and become like self-taught, getting your pet projects, and then getting involved into high corporations. And in fact, these very high corporate jobs, they don't really require any eligible part from your academia.
You're absolutely
or something
right.
Like that.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, there is a general trend for accounting firms, law firms, various forms of journalism to provide their own in-house testing of candidates, where they don't look at your degrees at all, but they just give you a kind of test. They interview you, and whatever training you might need to have, they'll provide it there. Right? So the thing is that you don't, you're absolutely right. And that is getting to be a bigger and bigger trend among the kinds of jobs that in the past you would have thought required at least a bachelor's degree.
I think it's sooner or later it's going to be big. It is like widespread phenomenon.
Yeah.
Because right now we're stuck upon this kind of CS and technocracy. And then they're just giving you a real, let's say, case scenario where it works, and then everyone just following up. But I do not understand why, for example, people from academia themselves, they're so much concerned about education, like in general. For example, my first episode was Michael Millerman, and he told me that, and I know why. Of course, I know why. He told me that education part is very crucial and important. And he was telling me the, as far as I believe, the influence from the liberal impact towards the younger generation. And right now, I think, even though I'm much critical towards liberalism, but I don't think you need to either fight it or doing something with it. You cannot just do anything. It just, how to explain it? It's just massive inertia, which just going with the flow. You cannot do anything with this.
Well, I guess so what you're saying basically is that the academic preoccupation with education is kind of pointless.
No. What I'm saying is, for example, the Michael Millerman, the guy from Canada who is involved into political philosophy, he was concerned about education in a way that it just shaping, let's say, the matrix of mentality, like across the globe, with liberal mentality.
Oh, I see. I see kind of this hegemonic kind of education that everybody's getting these days, turned into liberals.
Fukuyama part,
I see.
And
but is that happening anymore? That's not happening anymore. That's why everybody's complaining. Right? That's why the establishment is complaining so much. Right? That's why the establishment is going nuts, precisely because this kind of education is falling apart.
I have no idea why. As I already told you, I'm careless. Like absolutely unbothered about the educational impact towards humanity or like in general somewhere.
No, but you it's an important point because I do think so this business about everybody being trained to be a liberal globalist Fukuyama lover kind of person. It's true. I would say that so with the end of the Cold War, certainly, right? With the end of the Cold War, at least until 9/11. Now that's only 10 years, right? That was only 10 years between Fukuyama's book and the trade center in New York, World Trade Center in New York got blown apart. That was only 10 years, but it was during that period, right, which was a period of like, Clinton and Blair and all these guys, right? That there was this kind of liberal globalist consensus kind of thing going on. And I do think, yes, and I do think, that there was this kind of belief that if everybody got schooled in the same way, right, basically emanating from, a kind of a Europeanized America or an Americanized Europe or something like that, that the world would be saved. I mean, no, I think there was that belief around. But I think, over the last 25 years, that has seriously eroded, right? And I think, this is why I talk a lot in the recent past, I talk a lot about the post-truth condition, because one of the things that we're seeing now, and I think you're alluding to this, is that there is no kind of central, universal kind of educational template. No, people are, getting educated and finding out stuff by different means, and they're learning different things. And that is a source of a lot of the conflict and misunderstanding and everything else going on in the world. But nevertheless, that seems to be kind of what the norm is turning out to be, right? I mean, and I think all of that kind of move from any kind of universal globalist consensus kind of thing is actually very threatening to universities. That actually is very threatening to universities because universities kind of present themselves as kind of being the storehouse of all the things that are worth knowing in the world and so forth. And so if we're not teaching it to you, it's not worth knowing, right? I mean, and so much of the knowledge that people get and the knowledge that they value is actually coming from outside the university. There's no doubt about it. And is even anti-university in many respects, right? It's actually presenting ideas and presenting arguments that are completely counter to what the orthodoxy is teaching in universities. So all of that is true. All of that is true, and I think that is very threatening to the university. Mm-hmm. And your view is so much for that.
Yeah. So we just lost the connection with the university as a whole. Your book to judge and to justify us. It's just. For me, if I'm following the dynamics of education in 20th and 21st century, there was Humboldtian system where there is a skill-based line. Then it shifted to a credential part in the 20s when you need to enroll, for example, I don't know, in Oxford or something. And then especially after I'm just lining up this connection. The collapse of CSR and the trend of liberalism, Bologna system. And we have seen the current shift towards market-based education, where people are self-taught or either like getting education from the internet or so it just, the market is getting even more wider, and there is a lot of agents and there is a lot of companies where they're sort of competing with one another. And it's amplified during the COVID, I think, and especially even more boosted when DI appeared. How do you think?
Yeah. So all that's correct. And I think, see, the most interesting part of this, to me, I mean, I think the key moment came when universities, and this is something the universities themselves did, okay? I don't think the universities can blame anyone else for this. They did it to themselves. The universities made a big pitch, which they still make today, for being kind of frontline contributors to the so-called knowledge economy or the knowledge society, right? And that's where all this business about people needing to get degrees, to get credentials, to get jobs, that whole thing, right? Which really took off after after the Cold War, I suppose, but it was already happening after World War II, and this is the thing that originally was involved with neoliberalism, because part of this is the thing people often don't appreciate about the shift from a political economy standpoint. Under the welfare state, under the classic welfare state, the democratic socialism kind of thing that the West had for such a long time. Well, not such a long time, but certainly in the 20th century, the taxpayer, the ordinary taxpayer, would be funding universities even if they didn't go to universities, okay? And why was that, right? So back in the day, so when we're talking about, let's say, before the late 1980s, the percentage of people going to universities in most of the developed world, with the exception of the United States, was something in the order of 10 to 30%. Okay, United States was always about 50, 60%. And that changed. And that was because the whole political economy of how you justified funding education changed. Because, see, in the old welfare state, the idea was that the few elite people who actually got university education were going to be this amazing benefit to the rest of society, so it was worth the rest of society funding the education of those elite people. That was kind of the idea, and it was part of a multiplier effect argument. I don't know if you're familiar with this term. Multiplier effect is a term from John Maynard Keynes, who was a great economist of the welfare state, British economist, and the multiplier effect is basically when you pay for something, right? Then you look at all of the other things that enables that to pay for, right? So you have a kind of chain of payment across where everyone ends up benefiting in the long term. So it's a kind of multiplier effect funding higher education, according to this model. But that changed with neoliberalism. Neoliberalism got into a different kind of idea about funding higher education. And in fact, they funded higher education even more than the welfare state did. This is the point people often forget. But why were they doing that? They were doing it because they believed that going to a university was a form of human capital development. So in other words, they thought everybody should get a university education to improve everybody's productivity. And so universities loved this idea, right? Because that meant you'd have more students, you'd have bigger facilities, the government would be investing more. All of that happened, actually. All of that happened. Universities expanded massively under neoliberalism. However, the punchline was that the neoliberals then looked at the results of their investment, and they realized they weren't getting good enough return on investment. And so now we begin this other part of neoliberalism, which is to cut, to slash, to get rid of, right? And universities are really suffering because of that, because they promised they could do all these wonderful things, giving everybody credentials, and then the employment market doesn't bear this out. Universities aren't training people for the jobs that are available in the marketplace. And so what happens then is you get a surplus of overeducated people who are underemployed, and your productivity flatlines. And so neoliberals, again, thinking very much like economists on this, say, okay, we have to cut university education. We have to cut the size of universities. We have to cut all kinds of stuff. And that's what's happening now. But the universities were in on this at the beginning. They bought into this human capital development stuff. And that is kind of where we are. Now, you mentioned the business about markets. And this is a very interesting point. So I just mentioned, right, that there's a sense in which universities aren't training people for the labor market as it exists. So there's this really mismatch between the supply and demand side, right, of the labor force. And that's one problem. But the other problem also is that, as you say, and this is part of neoliberalism too, by the way, right? Because one of the things that neoliberalism does, as you know, is it tends to open up markets, right? So things that weren't markets before become markets. And then what the state does in neoliberalism is to basically regulate the market. But nevertheless, it opens the market and then regulates, but the state doesn't itself play favorites, you might say, on this. So what that means is that if you think about all the different things that universities do, they have competitors now in many different spaces. So think about the two major things universities do. One of them is research, the other is education. In both of those sectors of the university, right, there are now market competitors, and they're different, right? The people who are competing to supply education with universities are one bunch of people, all of these YouTube types, right? Online, education, all that jazz, right? But then there is the research side, right? And there you could think about, science parks that are, partly corporate funded or, all those kinds of things. And so both of these things are competing with universities and are being allowed to, right? And because they're competing with universities in very focused target markets, right? So the guys who are doing the online education aren't the guys doing the online research, whereas universities are doing both, right? These competitors are actually more agile from a market standpoint. They can change more easily, they can move more quickly than a university can. Universities are they're dinosaur-like, right? They're very lumbering creatures. They are not very well, they're not suited for markets, right? They're supposed to be institutions, right? They're not supposed to be markets. They're supposed to be institutions. And the problem is that the universities themselves, they start actually thinking about themselves as, research providers, content providers, right? In other words, they actually end up talking about themselves like they are players in a market. And if they go down that route too much, then they're just going to lose. Because universities are not designed in their current form to actually be these kind of nimble market players, right? And so this is a doom strategy, right? This is a doom strategy. Universities getting marketized like this, it's not going to end well.
Mm-hmm. And your personal feedback, what should we do right now? Like, look, if we're talking about academia.
Yeah. So, you mentioned this book of mine, To Judge and to Justify. And the reason why I gave that title to the book is related to, because my concern in writing all these books about the university is I'm interested in the future of the university. I think it's quite a positive thing. But we have to get clear what's so positive about it. Okay, this is the problem. We have lost focus. We have, in a sense, universities are trying to do all things for all people, and they're not doing any of them very well. That's basically where universities are these days. And so, my general view, and then I'll get to this To Judge and to Justify stuff because that's kind of the core point. Universities have to do less. They have to promise less. They might even have to get smaller. Right? And in a certain way, they might have to become more elite in some sense. At least they have to be able to kind of be able to select students who are actually appropriate for the kind of education that they will be getting at a university. Okay? So in other words, we have to move completely away from a kind of credentials orientation to university, and we have to move away from this other kind of idea that's sneaking in so much, where universities are basically, like big high schools, right? So in other words, a university is the place you go to if your high school education wasn't very good, right? So in other words, if you haven't quite figured out how to read and write yet, go to a university, right? They'll sort you out, right? I mean, because there's a lot of that going on now. And we just have to stop all that nonsense, really. And so that does mean that universities will have to restructure, will probably have to get smaller. And that's not itself a problem. I mean, it's a problem, obviously, for university staff and things like this, but I don't think it's a problem for society. I think society, it would be much healthier if a lot of state-based resources that are currently going to universities were shifted over to secondary and primary school education, vocational training, lots of that stuff, right? I mean, which often gets starved because everybody wants to have the best university in the world. And I think that's a complete mistake. Now, the point about to judge and to justify in all this is that you have to think about, like you say before, right? People can get information and knowledge from everywhere and anywhere, and they don't need to go to a university. And in fact, then because university knowledge is codified, and all that university knowledge that's codified in the research articles and books and everything, ChatGPT is eating that stuff, right? And has it, right? There's a sense in which you could even get, as it were, the university style knowledge by other means, without having to go to a university. It's that straightforward, right? I mean, generative artificial intelligence is kind of, doing a lot of what universities would be providing in terms of the outputs it produces. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, why it's so hard for academics to actually tell the difference between something generated by an academic and generated by artificial intelligence, is because the artificial intelligence actually has all that academic knowledge in it. And so what then does the university have that it's its own, right? What is it that the university has that's kind of exclusive to it? This is the question that needs to be asked, right? And this is where to judge and to justify come in, because I think what universities ought to do, and so this goes to the kind of teaching that happens at a university, that universities basically teach people how to be able to judge and justify. In other words, it takes for granted that the student will be exposed to all kinds of information, all kinds of knowledge. They'll be interested in knowledge, and they'll have all this stuff coming at them, and they'll have access to it all and everything. But what they may lack, and what you want them to at least become aware of, is that there is an issue of judgment here. In other words, how do you tell the difference between the good stuff and the bad stuff, right? All this stuff you're getting, right? How do you tell the difference? And then to be able to explain to other people why you have made those judgments. So in other words, you might say, this is a good, a good post. This is a bad post online, right? And then somebody says, but why? I believe the other guy. Why do you believe this guy? And then you are able to justify it. You're able to, provide an argument. You're able to provide reasons that the other person can understand. So at least if they still disagree with you, they understand why they disagree with you, rather than think of it as just, hostility or pigheadedness or something like that. And this is what I think a university could do. A university could, in fact, cultivate this kind of sense of judgment, right, where you can make decisions about what to believe, what not to believe, and then be able to explain to other people why it is you believe these things, and then have other people make their judgments and make their justifications. And I think if universities were very focused on that, right, as their activity, right, their core activity, that in fact I think that would be the best contribution that university could make to a knowledge environment that I think is going to become more and more democratic in a way, right, where everybody's going to have access to everything. All kinds of views are going to be mentioned and discussed, and all kinds of things that people used to think were crazy are going to people are going to start taking seriously. And so you have to be able to make judgments and justify your judgments. And that, I think, is what a university could do. And it could do it, and I think it's set up to do that kind of thing. And it does go back to a lot of the stuff that Humboldt and the people of the modern university who were training the next generation of citizens. Because remember, universities like the Humboldtian University became such a big deal in the 19th and 20th centuries because of nation building, right? About trying to educate citizens who would then be participating increasingly in the governance of their society, right? So it was a kind of a democratic expansionist project. And that's why you have statues of Humboldt, right, in the foyer of the National University of Mexico. Okay, UNAM, the largest university in Latin America. You go to the foyer of the main building, there's a statue of Humboldt right there, okay? And that was because, the idea is the university is the place to empower the citizenry. And how do you empower the citizenry? You give them, right, the skill set to be able to judge and justify. That's the point, right? And what I do in the book is basically talk about, a few recent philosophers of recent history who influenced me, who in fact I see as having exemplified this kind of quality of mind.
This is a bit different from the perspective that I remember you, for example, once again 3 years ago. Because back then, when the post-truth kind of this trend appeared, you were claiming that you are ultra-left and pro-Popperian, all of that stuff. Yeah. But right now, you're getting even, more conservative. You're like, let's go back to Humboldtian.
No. Listen to what I'm saying. I'm just mentioning Humboldt as a precedent. You think Kant's old-fashioned? No. The thing is that these ideas are still very current, and they go against the trend in the sense that I think there's a tendency now for people on the left to be more accommodating, and to kind of. No, I don't see it as let's put it this way. I don't even see where the conservatism is, except for the fact that I mentioned a 19th century figure.
I mean, from your perspective, as far I can see, it should have been better if we just gave up on academia and put everything on the markets where everyone is competing with one another.
Well, see, this I think is the alternative. I agree with you that so in other words, I believe that you might say the default position, right? So in other words, the burden of proof is on the university to justify its continued existence. That's the way I look at it. The university cannot take its existence for granted anymore, right? And I do think the default position is not the position that universities exist forever, but rather the default position is what you say, namely that universities dissolve into a marketplace, right? And based, and I think that is the default position, in which case then you have to defend what is special about the university.
Okay, now I
you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I do think this market thing that you're describing is real, right? I mean, it's there.
Mm-hmm. And you have mentioned artificial intelligence was tightly connected with education. What is your, for example, general overview towards AI for educational purposes and as well as for human being in general?
Okay, so my general view is somewhat positive. Let's put it that way. I don't believe in the existential risk and, we're going to be eaten by computers or something. I don't believe that. I do think one of the things that artificial intelligence, so I think it's a positive thing. I think, and I do think an interesting, I think, let's put it this way. Most of the fears about artificial intelligence come from people who are in a way imagining artificial intelligence as radically different from us, right? So in other words, every time we hear these stories about risk and undermining humanity and all this stuff, right? It's from a standpoint of a sort of B-rated science fiction movie from the 1950s, right? Where the computers rise up against us or something like this. And there's this very clear sense of them versus us. And I don't think that's the way to set up the issue at all, because I think already we are in a situation where people are already having fairly substantial relationships with forms of artificial intelligence to the point that they are dependent on them. And so what we're seeing already is something a bit more like a cyborg existence. Where in a sense the computer and the human, even though we are still physically different, nevertheless from the standpoint of identity, right? So from the standpoint of the ontology of the situation, you might say, are actually coming closer together. Right. So and in fact, there have been, there was this famous Supreme Court case in California where what basically the judge ruled was that a person could have a single identity, but be physically distributed in the sense that the person's smartphone could be considered not the property of the person, but part of the person themselves. Right? So the ontology, it's physically distributed, but it is physically distributed parts of a unified person. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, this has got legal recognition already. Now, it seems to me this is just the beginning, that we are going to go increasingly down this route. And so I don't see. I mean, I think that it'll just be normalized over time, basically, and that I think the bigger issue is how do you individuate persons, regardless of whether how much of them. How much of the activity is happening in their physical body versus happening in a smartphone or a computer or something like that. But how do you individuate persons under those circumstances? I think that's going to be more the kind of issue, the ontological issue there. But I think what's happening is that we're getting a more expanded notion of human personhood. I think that would be, kind of where I would begin the discussion would be at that point. When we look at whether things like ChatGPT are original or creative or whatever, I think very often what we're talking about here, so my inclination would be to say yes to those questions. I think that what we're talking about here is that given that ChatGPT is fed with data that comes from humans, right? All these texts and things that we've produced. What it can do that much more effectively than we can do as human beings is it can combine and recombine and scan and analyze, right? So in other words, it can have a much better kind of surveillance sense of all of the information that it has within itself. Whereas human beings, even though we produce all this information and we produce all this knowledge, our surveillance capacities over that knowledge is not so great. It really relies on various forms of extended memory, right? And very often, a lot of stuff gets produced and just gets ignored by human beings, right? And forgotten and misremembered and all of that stuff. Whereas with ChatGPT, and as it improves, right, it will actually have much greater facility and fluency in using and reproducing that material. And so, not surprisingly, I expect that we will find more and more, creative, original, whatever you want to call it, kinds of things coming from it, because they are basically what ChatGPT can do is it can give possibilities for thinking, for ideas that the humans themselves, in a way, created but never fully realized. Okay, and that's kind of where I would put it. So I mean, there's some very interesting philosophical questions here about the psychology of it and the ontology of it and all that stuff. Sure, but I do think my overall perspective on it is pretty positive.
I remember you early on. Once again, the question about post-truth. You were always keep telling the phrase of democratization of knowledge.
Right.
And first thing I wanted to ask you after the appearance of ChatGPT, whether isn't it ChatGPT is a pure embodiment of democratization of knowledge?
Yes, I think so. Yes, in fact, I don't think I've told you this, but I've been to China twice in the last couple of months, and actually spoke about this topic in China, because I do think,
How is China, by the way?
Well, China seems to be doing fine. But the thing is that yes, I was speaking about this because I do believe it's an example of the democratization of knowledge, and I was talking about in because in the field of information science, there is this phenomenon. I don't know if you've run across it in my writings. I've talked about this before, and it's well established in information science. It's called undiscovered public knowledge. Okay? And undiscovered public knowledge is basically stuff that is published, and we're talking about academic works here. We're talking about the stuff in the journal articles and the books, that kind of stuff, right? But it's never read or cited, right? It's just there, right? People are producing this stuff all the time. In fact, up to 80% of everything that is published by academics is either uncited or unread. And the reason why they produced this stuff, of course, is because they needed for credentials. They needed to get a job.
Of course.
They need for promotion, right? You understand, right? But they don't produce this stuff in order for it to be read or understood or anything like that. Now here comes ChatGPT. ChatGPT, its database is basically this stuff, right? It's all this stuff that's ever been published. I mean, academics have been getting very upset about this, but this is inevitable, right? All the major publishing houses, right, that publish academic material have been basically selling their stuff at low prices to companies like OpenAI and so forth, right, to improve the databases. So in other words, all this academic stuff's being front-loaded into ChatGPT, right? And so ChatGPT doesn't have the academic biases, because the reason why most stuff isn't read is because academics are trained to read only in the areas, right, that they're working on, and the areas they're working on are the ones that the discipline rewards, right? The ones that discipline values, the ones that'll get you the jobs in the fields you want to go into, all that jazz, right? The ones that will get you the research grants, right? And there are a narrow bunch of fields in every discipline that fill that bill. And that means that 80% of the stuff that's produced does not get taken seriously, does not get the sort of serious treatment it perhaps deserves. ChatGPT does not have those biases. ChatGPT can just, you ask it a question, it'll survey everything, and it will come up with some answers. And those answers may be surprising, not because they're wrong, but because they are actually accessing already existing literatures that no human has bothered to take seriously before. And now ChatGPT presents it to you as your answer. That's democratization for you.
Speaking about the bias part, there is a thing, it's called RLHF, Reinforcement Learning Human Feedback.
Yeah.
It's created by engineers of OpenAI. What it does is trying to train data in a way that it could have been, let's say, positively reacted from the customers, okay? Because data, it doesn't speak for themselves, okay? And for example, Sam Altman and the team of OpenAI is trying to do is train algorithms in a way that it could have been understandable and let's say fitted in the current paradigm, let's say, which is for me, this is exactly where the bias is coming from, because as I already have said, of course, as I already have said, data doesn't speak for themselves. If you're training algorithms, algorithms, they're just how to explain it? They're not just separate separate entities. It needs to be navigated, and OpenAI is doing something like that. And for me, this is very at the fundamental level, even in terms of ontology. It's the serious, let's say, influence on the people, even at the basic mundane level. When you're putting in input and the ChatGPT, it gives you the output. It's just shaped by this kind of X narrative.
I agree. And it does concern me.
Yeah, and if we just move further the consequence of that is that, by the way, do you know that the creation of ChatGPT is a just unprecedented event in human history? It's the fastest growing company in the world that could have been. There is not even comparison with that. It just for 2 months, something like it just appeared out of nowhere, and then everyone is using ChatGPT. Like it's just outgrowth Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp, whatever. For me, this is very how to explain it? This is anxious symptom, because if even how Sam Altman said that people, I mean young people, overly rely on ChatGPT too much, they're becoming not just dependent on the algorithms, which is shaped by LHF and OpenAI. They're just shaping human mentality, so to speak.
No, I agree. That's a serious issue.
Yeah, and then if you're moving further, you would understand that it's not on. Okay, this is the fastest growing company in the world, and they rank one, let's say, technocracy that is leading in the global stage. Okay, there is some just few subjects who are competing with one another, another. That could have been China, DeepSeek, and I don't know, something like how's it called?
Anthropic.
Anthropic, yeah. But they're not rivals. OpenAI, the one who created the landscape since the beginning, owns everything: the algorithms, the data centers. Even DeepSeek was copy-pasted, as far as I believe, copy-pasted from...
Yes, that's what we're told.
From the opinion. Yeah. And then you realize that, all right, we have rank one company, the biggest in the world, which is, relatively speaking, the monopoly of human knowledge, and it's being shaped by the algorithms. And the people on the board who is deciding what is going to put it on the, let's say, policy, politics, specific trains, scripts, and the let's say twisting parts. All of that depends on the only one single agent, and we don't even aware of that. This is quite serious. Problem.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with you more. You're absolutely right. And I guess and this is something that is worth kind of really, well, governments ought to get involved in this. I mean, to have a look at this. But I would where I was coming from on this. So and it's a really important point. Is I'm always thinking that my way of getting into this issue is from the standpoint of the biases that are incredibly strong that exist within the academic culture, the pre-AI culture. And I think whatever biases that are being brought in by OpenAI, and again, you're absolutely right, they're not those biases. They're not the academic biases. Okay? It's a different kind of way of thinking about how you bias the system, you might say. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from on that. But there is a kind of interesting question, I suppose, about look, all these systems, in order to be accessible, they're going to have some bias built into them. Right? They're going to have some kind of bias built into them. They can't just be random searches.
Of course.
So, right. And so we have, one has to think about how do we need a kind of a philosophy of this, you might say. And it's a very interesting problem.
No, the narrative which I'm trying to spread on let's say on the global stage is that there is one single actor right now at the moment, which is OpenAI. But if we're talking about, let's say, multipolarity, deglobalization, blah blah blah, it's
but then isn't the answer then try to influence that actor?
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, if you want it to change, I mean, I'm not sure because I just say, oh, there's this one actor, it sounds like almost fatalism or something. I mean, but if you want to do something positive, I would have thought then if you think it's really just one actor who's in charge of the whole thing, it's all down to Sam Altman or something, then, you would think about trying to influence him.
Have you, do you actually use ChatGPT on your daily basis?
I gotta say, I have used it, it doesn't. I mean, I know there are a lot of people who, once they start using it, get really into it. I'm not one of them. I'm not one of them.
You're not impressed.
I'm not saying I'm not impressed. I don't know. I mean, look, I'm used to using ordinary Google search engines, and I know now that they're getting they got this too. I don't know. It's very funny. Maybe no. But then my interaction with a lot of this tech stuff, even if I'm talking about it, is kind of a I don't know. I'm not personally. No, I don't feel drawn into it. I have friends who are. I have friends of my generation who have been drawn into it and even have conversations with it and stuff like that. I mean, I actually have people in my age group are doing this, right? And they find it very, I don't know what, they find it very interesting or something. But no, not me. I'm not in that category.
I've been using ChatGPT for 4 months right now. And there's a lot of pitfalls, obstacles overall. And mostly I would say it's rather negative for me. Like, if we're getting away from this kind of naive expectation that there is like really artificial intelligence that is thinking or understanding, of course it's not. My overview towards ChatGPT is that I shouldn't rely even at the major output, which is like 80% what it says. Like, there's a lot of hallucinations, if you might heard of it.
Sure.
There's a lot of hallucinations if you're putting too much data, and ChatGPT is recreating another data which is quite similar to your input. But there is another thing which is I call improvisation. If there is a very small data, very less, and it start improvising.
Yes.
This is two sides of the problem. And of course, the most essential problem that it just doesn't understand anything. It's just being trained by statistical correlation out of global data, which is another problem for me, because how can I trust something which is grabbed out of just massive data, which is, quite... It doesn't fit me, Like,
well, I mean, even if it's just academic data, right? You think about where the data is coming from. Most of it will come from the United States and Europe.
Yeah. This is my honest, let's say, reaction towards current trend of artificial intelligence. This is already 2 hours past.
Oh, I want to just say one thing, because I understand we're closing. But I want to say one thing to get it to just for a second to get it back to the judge and justify stuff. I teach a media course here at Warwick, and what I ask the students to do is to generate 2 ChatGPT responses to one of several questions that are related to the things I'm lecturing on in the course, and then I ask them to judge which is better, which of these 2. They generate one answer to the question, and then they're asked to generate a second answer to the question, and then they have to compare them and to judge which one is better and why. And see, that's the to judge and justify part that I bring into the ChatGPT business.
For me, you're just turning back to the ancient Greece, where you have to be sort of a philosopher.
What's wrong with doing that?
modernity.
Wait, because aren't we going to be increasingly faced with this kind of situation?
I'd say that there's only, let's say, few people that could have been philosophers, not everyone.
Well, I don't know. Students do okay on this. Though I have to check to see whether they use ChatGPT to do the judging thing.
I'm more meritocratic in a way, more hierarchical, that, you cannot just train every single individual to become a, philosopher. I do understand that it's quite efficient in this enlightenment model of meta thinking process.
Yeah, that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah. But as I already have said, this is not the case for me. That's why I'm not bothered and not concerned about education as a whole.
Yes.